Wild clay is so dang much fun to come out in the country and find yourself. And I've made a lot of videos showing how to find and use wild clay. The problem is a lot of my viewers are not interested in firing their pottery outdoors. They have an electric kiln that they'd like to use it in. Now, I don't use an electric kiln. In fact, up until rather recently, I'd never used an electric kiln. However, today I'm going to show you how to experiment and use your wild clay in an electric kiln so that you know what temperature to fire it at. So I don't own an electric kiln or even have access to one on a regular basis. Believe it or not, I actually have friends that use electric kilns. Yeah, I know I'm not very choosy about who I make friends with, but I do have friends with electric kilns. In this case, I made arrangements to go up to my friend's house and test 3 different wild clays in an electric kiln and then show you the results and talk a little bit about how we determine at what temperature we can fire these clays to. One of the important elements of this experiment are these clay slabs that my friend made. Because we don't know at what temperature these wild clays might melt, completely liquefy, we don't want those to melt down and get in the bottom of the kiln and ruin it. So she made these clay slabs to set the pots on top of. So every clay is different. That's the first thing you need to know. Every clay is going to handle different temperatures, it's going to break down at different temperatures. And so when you find a new clay, you have to learn where that is, especially if you're firing in an electric kiln. So with an outdoor firing like I do, almost none of my clay can be overfired at the temperatures I can reach outdoors. So it's very unlikely, it's very unusual for me to get any clay that's going to break down in the kind of firing I do. So I don't worry about it so much. But if I'm firing in an electric kiln, it's really important to know where that clay starts to break down because you don't want it to melt in there and make a mess in the bottom of your kiln. It can ruin your kiln. So it's really important to know how hot you can fire it. The only way to know that is to run some test firings. To fire it low, fire it a little higher, to fire it higher, find out where it starts to break down. And so that's what I'm doing here today. And not really for my own knowledge, but to help you guys, those of you that are firing in electric kilns, to kind of know how to go about this. So I brought 3 different clays with me today. I brought one from near Tucson, I brought one from far southeast Arizona near Bisbee, and I brought one from up in northern Arizona on the Mogollon Rim. So 3 very different clays. I've got a red clay, a brown clay, and a gray clay. So we're firing little test bowls of those 3 clays in this kiln. We set it to cone 03, which is about 2100 Fahrenheit or 1160 Celsius. And so then that's over what I can achieve in an outdoor firing. That's quite a bit over what I can achieve in an outdoor firing. And if these clays happen to survive this firing intact, then I might do this again and run it up to an even higher temperature if I was going to be using these in an electric kiln, so I knew where those points were that they break down. One thing that's really different about electric kilns from the way I fire is that they ramp up really slow and they ramp back down really slow. This is to protect the pots from thermal shock. Now, I temper the heck out of my clay with about 20 to 30% temper, and this protects them from thermal shock because I fire outdoors where I have very fast ramp up and ramp down time. So we loaded these in the kiln and turned it on and went away for about 2.5 hours. And when we came back, it was just then getting up to around 270 degrees Fahrenheit. So like oven temperature after 2.5 hours. I was very disappointed. I traveled a long way from Tucson up to Phoenix to fire these. And so I didn't have time to sit around all day and wait for these to finish firing. So I went ahead and went home and came back the next morning. So I went home, I came back here this morning and we opened the kiln and here's what we found. This kiln fired up to about 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, or it's about 1100 degrees Celsius, something like that. And everything came through fine. This is my old Sonoyta Highway Red. This is my Mogollon Dream Clay from the Mogollon Rim. And this is my double adobe white from down near Bisbee. The plates they're sitting on all look good. This one left kind of a weird shadow on here. I have no idea what caused that. I wonder if it could be the calcium carbonate that's in this clay. So everything survived well at that temperature. So now we're going to try to run it up to an even higher temperature to see if we can figure out exactly at what temperature these clays start to fail. So in firing these pots to over 1000 degrees Celsius, I thought for sure at least one of those clays was going to melt. Specifically that old Sonoyta Highway Red. I've misfired that a number of times in outdoor firings where wind come up on my fire and the temperature got way over 900 degrees Celsius, and I had some strange results which looked like overfiring. But in this case, they fired to over 1,000 degrees Celsius and they seemed to be nothing wrong with them. All the pots were perfect. They rang really good, so I knew they were well fired. But the strangest thing to me was that none of these pots showed any evidence of being overfired whatsoever. Believe it or not, at this point I was disappointed that the pots had come out perfect. So the idea was we were going to load these up in the kiln again and fire it up to an even hotter temperature to see if we could get some sort of overfiring result. This time we fired up to almost 1,200 degrees Celsius. And again, I went home knowing that they wouldn't be done until quite a bit later. And the next day, we got what we were looking for. That little pot that I'd made out of double adobe white clay had completely melted. But there were more surprises in store, because the other pots, although they looked perfect, were actually stuck to the tiles underneath of them. So they had melted a little bit as well. So this is exactly what you're looking for when you're testing these wild clays. So let's talk about what we learned from these two firings. So first of all, from the first firing, we know that all three of these clays work fine at that first temperature. We can safely fire these clays at this temperature. For the second temperature, however, first of all, we know that the double adobe white doesn't really work at that temperature. It should be backed off quite a bit, probably fired more at the first temperature. We also know that the other two clays, Old Sonoyta Highway and the Mogollon Dream Clay, can be fired at this higher temperature, but it's a little bit too hot. As we saw, they stuck to the kiln furniture. So again, maybe back that off just a little bit or fire to the first temperature. So if you've got wild clays that you're hoping to fire in your electric kiln, this gives you a model for how to go about experimenting and finding out at what temperature to fire them at. Now, I'm no expert at electric kilns, and these friends of mine that were helping, they know a lot about firing in electric kilns, but they don't know a lot about experimenting with wild clays. So I'm sure there's a lot more to this subject than I'm able to cover here. But I also think this is very helpful to set up a pattern for how you can go about experimenting and finding out at what temperatures you can safely fire your wild clays to without damaging your kiln. A while back, I did a video where I was doing the opposite, okay? Instead of taking wild clays and firing them in an electric kiln, I was taking commercial clays and firing them outdoors. So it was kind of the opposite of this experiment. I took a selection of commercial clays, I made bowls out of them, and then I fired them in a big outdoor fire. So you might want to watch this and see how to take your commercial clays and fire them outdoors like I do. Surprisingly, some of these clays actually survived that fire without any damage. So go check that out. I'll put that video right over here. I appreciate you coming on my adventure with me today. I'll catch you next time.